Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Human Challenge, where we explore all the human challenges in today's world, the challenges of being human, and how we can challenge ourselves to be more human for the greater good. I'm your host, Vanessa. Today, we're joined by Elspeth Hay, author of Feed Us with Trees. I got it right here. Beautiful, colorful cover. Elspeth is also the host of the Local Food Report on Cape Cod's local NPR station, which is also available online as a podcast. Welcome to the show, Elspeth.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Thank you. And thank you for this beautiful work. I enjoyed reading a lot of it. It was so fascinating. And I know here, maybe people can't see, but the kind of subheading for the book is Nuts in the Future of Food. And I got to tell you, I did not know all this magical things about acorns.
Yeah, neither did I until about 5 or 6 years ago. And I live in an oak forest, so learning that we can eat acorns kind of blew my mind. I had been reporting on food and the environment for more than 15 years, and no one had ever talked about eating an acorn. And I ended up, a friend sent me a TEDx talk by a woman in Greece named Marcy Mayer, who said that acorns are edible, they're a superfood, they're one of humanity's oldest foods, and that sent me deep down an acorn rabbit hole.
I was really amazed, and I remember like stepping into my own backyard looking for acorns, and I was like kind of showing off to my dog. I was like, "Look at this! You don't know what this thing can do, girl. Like this is pretty powerful, pretty impressive." Um, I really enjoyed reading this book because I feel like you're bringing together so many different worlds, and it really did make me think a lot about food consumption, food production, and so maybe you can tell us a little bit more about why you wrote this book.
So I grew up in Maine, so always been a New England kid, and my parents are bird watchers, so they watch and study birds. And I spent a lot of time as a young person being sort of dragged on bird watching adventures around the state of Maine. And my parents were always explaining the way that different birds fit into their habitats, right? So sapsuckers drill these rows of holes in maples and birches. They were telling me about, other species that had mandibles. I think they're called crossbills. Now I'm forgetting the name, but their mandibles are perfectly built for extracting seeds from conifers. And then we would just go home and get our food from the grocery store, which, I knew was coming from these farm fields and in a lot of cases industrial farms where we were destroying the habitats, natural ecosystems like the ones that the birds relied on. And I don't think I could have really articulated it, but I found that pretty devastating and sad that we were like this one species that didn't really seem to fit into the natural world, didn't seem to have a habitat. Um, and I think that just kind of lodged in my brain and my body and stayed there. And I kept asking people questions about food. That's been my job for the past 15 plus years. So when I learned that we can eat acorns, it was sort of this aha moment of like, wait, maybe we do fit, and maybe it's just that I don't know how we fit and we've lost a lot of knowledge. So that was what got me excited. And then the more people I talked to about not just oak trees, but other nut trees that are keystone trees, trees that are really important in their ecosystems and also have a long history with humans, the more excited I got and the more I wanted to tell other people about it. So that's how I got going.
When I hear you speak, the one thing that really sticks in my head is how it's almost like humans, we like didn't have a natural habitat, right? And I don't know, like that's something that kind of sits with me because I'm like, true, it's true. Like everything that we've had to build, right? Like we didn't really over civilization, right? Like what happened? It's like we've just built concrete buildings, and maybe there was a different way that we could have done this, right? And so that's what jumps out at me when I hear you say that.
There's such a colonial legacy at this point where colonialism has spread to a lot of places in the world. And that idea that we can't meet our needs from native ecosystems is really a colonial worldview. And if we go back to, anywhere we are and we start looking at how indigenous people and traditional cultures were doing things, usually they were meeting almost all of their needs from the local environment. And I think that as a kid, I would read these histories, right? I loved like historical fiction was my favorite genre of book as a kid. And I would always wonder, like, okay, how come they could do that now? Or how come people are not now, then? How come people were part of places then and we're not now? Like, what happened? But I didn't really know anyone with any practical skills for getting food or fibers or medicines or anything like that from our ecosystem. So now it's been like, I feel like now that I've learned more about these nut trees, I'm like, okay, what else? Like, I've gotten really into weaving baskets. I'm like, oh, I want to weave
Yes.
with cattails. Like, now I'm just like, show me everything. How do we live here? How do we get into relationship with our places? And that, I don't think that's ever going to stop being exciting to me.
Right. Oh, that's really beautiful. How do we get into relationships with these places? Oh, that's yeah, really, really beautiful words. I have just because you're talking about like these different like the weaving and all that. Like I'm curious, kind of what is that experience almost, right? Like the emotions that come up that come up for you when you're engaged in these types of ways of building these relationships with places.
I think it's deeply satisfying and fills this real hole. You know, we tend to talk about and think about dominant Western culture as this pinnacle of civilization. And, you know, we're so lucky to live in this time because we have all these material resources. But I think that what we've built is really disconnected from the ecosystems around us. And that leads to this real uh, poverty of connection, if that makes sense. And every time I'm, you know, out picking mushrooms or gathering nuts or learning to weave with plants that are in my local ecosystem, it just reignites this feeling of being alive and being in relationship. And it's in the same ways that I think moving away from it can become addictive because that's the history that we've seen over the past several hundred years. You know, we're just getting farther and farther away from the places where we live. Getting back into relationship, there's just so much joy and so much satisfaction. And I think, you know, environmental, I don't know, reform, for lack of a better phrase, is often phrased as like, oh, you know, we'll have to sacrifice, we'll have to really give up a lot. But I'm not sure that's true. I mean, we may have to stop doing things a certain way, but I think that what we will gain in connection and joy and just the satisfaction that comes from being part of an ecosystem and making something with your hands and actually understanding the place where you live, I think will just be such a benefit, at least, and it, you know, it has been in my life.
I know in the book you talk a little bit about like productivity, right? And especially when we consider that from the context of like the food industry or just like production in general, right? And I know you kind of addressed that a little bit in the book, and so I wanted you to kind of share with us, a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think I always understood that we used to be hunter gatherers, you know, humans in general. And then our population kept growing and we transitioned to agriculture, right? The agricultural revolution. And we had to do that because farming is more productive. And so, yeah, maybe being in relationship with these ecosystems was better for the planet and better for our health. But bummer, we can't do that anymore. There's too many of us. And it turns out that that's really a lie. That's not true. If you look at any kind of, I mean, I looked at it from so many different angles and really fleshed it out in the book. But that is a story that was written to separate land from people and people from land and to enable colonial violence. And if you actually look at the, you know, net food productivity of different ecosystems, a monoculture of corn or soy is nowhere near as productive as, say, a flourishing oak savanna. And there's a lot of different ways to look at it, but one way of looking at it that I think we forget about is we hear about these really high yields from these monoculture fields, and we're only measuring what's coming off the land, right? So the output, but we're not measuring all the inputs. So if we're actually serious about feeding the, I don't know what it is right now, 8.1 billion people, I think, on Earth, land is the limiting factor, right? Not just the land where you're growing the corn, but actually all the land that you need to grow those monocultures. And when you look at all the land involved, they're much less productive. You know, that it's no contest. It's significantly makes significantly less sense ecologically to do things that way. You've got all the land that it took to make the tractor, to make the fuel that made the tractor, to make the fertilizer, to transport all of that. And that's incredibly land intensive. And so this idea that, industrial farming is the only way because we have to feed everyone, in addition to being a lie because it doesn't produce as much food, we're also not eating most of that food. A lot of it's getting turned into ethanol and other products. So there's a lot of different ways to look at it, but it's definitely eye opening to really dive deep. And when I did, it debunked a lot of things that I had thought my whole life.
And what was that like for you? Kind of suddenly the world looks different.
It was confusing for a
Yeah.
while, and I kept, second guessing myself, and thinking I must be wrong. I'm going to look at it another way because really these ecosystems can't be that productive. Like, why would we have changed? And I think that was what led me to start researching some of the social history, because it really only makes sense when you look at it in a social and economic context, because ecologically it makes no sense at all. So I think when we look at the history a little bit, then we can put it in perspective. And that definitely has been a long process for me, and I suspect will be an ongoing process for, most of my life, since a lot of these stories and narratives that we have around food and food production took hundreds of years to construct, and they're going to take a while to deconstruct too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But I mean, I think I love to hear this part of the conversation though, too, because I think a lot of us kind of see it, right? It's like we can see it, but it feels almost vague because we don't have the language for it, or we don't have the education or the knowledge about it, right? And so it can be confusing. And that's when we get into that, like just denying of it. And so we just sort of go back to what we know. But I think it's really important to have this conversation of just sharing, like, yeah, it is confusing, but kind of stick with it so that we can dismantle it and we can create that change. I think another thing that you also talked about, and how this may have helped you in some of this, was some of the ancestry work you did and even just engaging with Indigenous people, correct?
Yeah, I spent a bit of time in present day Northern California and a lot of time on Zoom with a friend there who I got to know through researching the book. Ron Reed, he's a member of the Kuruk tribe, and uh, when he would tell me stories about Kuruk culture and Kuruk beliefs, they were so different from what I had grown up with and understood. And a lot of his stories were about humans having a job in the natural world, or I actually don't really like to use that term anymore, the living world, right? Because we draw these lines between human created landscapes and natural landscapes, but really that's sort of an artificial line that we're drawing. And I started learning from him about some of the social history out there and the ways that through suppression of prescribed fire, for instance, and other um, European, not just land management practices, but also, there was a bounty on indigenous people's heads in California where settlers were paid to kill indigenous people. And there's a really ugly history that we don't talk about in public schools in America that's not discussed. And when you first hear that, I think the first response for me as someone from Euro American heritage is shame, and I think that that's a response that makes a lot of sense. But also, as I went back and tried to understand, like, what is going on here? What's wrong with my ancestors? Why would people do this? Um, I guess I'm an optimist. I don't like to believe that anyone is fundamentally horrible. People get traumatized, and hurt people, as the phrase goes. And when I followed it back, there was this other history that we don't really talk about the internal colonization of Europe. We tell this story of European colonists coming here because it was a land of opportunity, right? That's the story I learned growing up in school. That's the story I learned from the communities that I grew up in. And in fact, a lot of early European immigrants were exiled from their own land where they had been living for hundreds, thousands of years. Um, and we sort of swept that under the rug. We say, oh, we wanted to come here. And when we look back at it, most people really didn't want to come here from Europe. They were forced to come here by really terrible circumstances in Europe that were caused by those in power trying to separate people from the land. And then that legacy of trauma and harm has just expanded with colonialism and replayed again and again and again. And I think that if we want to change that and we want to start getting back into right relationship with each other and with our ecosystems, we have to grapple with that history and we have to understand it so that we can move forward. I think that sweeping it under the rug has been our tactic for a while, and it's becoming increasingly clear that it's time to move on from that way of trying to deal with it. It's not working, you know. People, it needs to be out in the open.
What do you think are things that we need to do in order for us to, for it to be more in the open, for us to have these dialogues? What invitation would you extend to the rest of us to help kind of transform this?
I think going back through your own family's history and trying to understand how you got to where you are now. You know, where did your people come from? Why did they come? Uh, what, you know, in what ways were they part of perpetuating the legacy, and in what ways have they been hurt by the legacy? And then at the same time, looking at the social history of Indigenous groups in the place where you live and understanding the interaction between, you know, the group that you come from and the group that has traditionally lived in the area where you are and other places too. You know, we don't talk about it, but there was a war that European colonists waged on Indigenous people in North America for more than 300 years, if you really look at it. And we just don't talk about it. I think just even talking about it, acknowledging it, you know, if you think about relationships that you have in your life, there's nothing worse than saying, "Hey, I'm hurting, this thing happened," and the other person saying, "That thing didn't happen." No, it didn't. Like, so I think that acknowledging what has happened is a really important first step. And then understanding, you know, your part in it. And I think in order to move forward, those are really necessary first steps.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I want to say thank you for, I think, offering a very human perspective to all of this. I think for myself, also doing my own inner work, um, you're right. Like it is. I think I see when I'm listening to you, I see how I've also been stuck in some of these narratives of just thinking this is the only way I know how to do this inner work or how to actually engage in it the right way. And so I think this is a really, really great invitation for all of us to try and do this a little differently and stop getting
Yeah.
stuck in the shame cycles.
And also, I think, you know, there isn't necessarily one right way. There's probably lots of right ways. And as long as I have a great mentor who always says this, you know, your inner self is curious. So if you're approaching the work with curiosity, then I think you're headed in the right direction. It's a good place to start.
Absolutely. I love that so much. I love those words from your mentor. I one question, one more that's just like popping up for me as we're having this particular conversation. I mean, you've obviously done a lot of inner work, a lot of ancestry work, and I'm curious if there's ever a point. Did you ever feel kind of angry? Because sometimes I've gone through it, and I'm like, why do I feel like I'm the only one in my lineage doing all this work, which is like ego based, but it's true, right? I have those moments sometimes. I'm curious if you've had those moments and how you may have dealt with them or handled them.
I'm trying to think. I guess I've probably felt angry, although that's not the feeling that stands out. I feel more sad. I think
Yeah.
um, it's really sad, and I think that sort of trying to start healing that has allowed me to reconnect with some of my own ancestry and move past this idea of like, oh, my people are bad, there's something wrong with us, which I do think for me has been really tied to our food stories and our dominant cultural narrative in general. Because, you know, if we're a species without a habitat and no home in the natural world, and the best thing we can do for the environment is disappear and go away, well, yeah, you do think like there's something wrong with us. We're just bad. We're wrong. And that's a that's not a narrative I want to hand my kids. I don't think there's much to do with that. That's what I got as a kid. And, you know, where do you take that? That's we sort of there's another I forget the name of it, but there's this sort of psychology concept where the idea is like we act out our expectations of ourselves. If we believe we're bad, then we'll act bad. If we believe we're bad for the environment, then we're going to be bad for the environment. If we believe that we can have a really important role in our landscapes and be part of creating more life, more biodiversity, stabilizing our climate, then I think that we'll do that. I think we want to do good. We want to be a part of a healthy place and in healthy relationships. And it's it's not always obvious to us how to do that. So doing that work is important, not just spiritually, but also ecologically, and I think can really move us forward.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm going to share one more time. Feed Us with Trees, available now and online, correct? Every online
Yeah.
channel and wherever books are sold. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for these words of wisdom. And thank you for this very human approach to everything that you do. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.